This entire week has been really, really busy for me, so I just wanted to apologize to everyone. This is going to be a normal video. I wanted to do a bunch of editing and talk about stuff, but I just couldn't. I'm just a big ball of nerves. Next week, I'm going to be leaving for the trip, and I'm just worried about it, and I've just got a lot on my plate, just tons of stuff to think about. Uh, I was going to talk about ranks and jobs at conventions, how everything works and how everything works within a convention. Like, the senior level people versus, the newbie volunteers and how their ranks work. But honestly, I just don't have time. I'm going to be going to the Lilac City Comic Con this Saturday, and I'm going to be taking my 360 camera with me. So look forward to a video on that. And I had a big pack meeting. That's Cub Scouts. All the little Cub Scouts met together, and we handed out awards, and we did this little thing. And unfortunately, there was a problem with it. So that brought up a really interesting question: how do we do show kindness versus action shows? And that sounds weird, but I'm not going to go too into it. Basically put, I want you to imagine Mr. Rogers. Mr. Rogers is an iconic figure in children's... Hi, Aaron. Mr. Rogers is an iconic figure found in children's television shows, and, just you see this picture and you immediately imagine his voice. Same thing happens with the Power Rangers. Without even thinking about it, I can tell you the Power Rangers, and you just imagine them fighting bad guys and all that stuff. So here's a question. Could the Power Rangers be on Mr. Rogers? Well, yeah, of course they can. The Incredible Hulk was on Mr. Rogers, and this was when the Incredible Hulk was out. So they made sure that Lou Ferrigno could show that, he was just an ordinary guy, he was wearing a costume, and he wasn't really that violent. Video games on Mr. Rogers. He went and he played video games with people. He asked how to play. He showed them how to properly, treat things, and he was very nice about it. And even the Wicked Witch was on Mr. Rogers, and, she was there to show that being a Wicked Witch was all an act, and she wasn't actually there to hurt people. So the Power Rangers could totally appear on Mr. Rogers. And yet... But, Mr. Rogers and Power Rangers often have the same morals and talk about action in the same way. They often talk about, we should help more people. We should learn how to control our anger. It's okay to go through problems. We are all learning and we're all growing. And, they would totally work off of each other and do it. But there's a conflict in our minds, and we don't want to admit to it. We don't want to admit to anybody that we just can't see that. You can't see Mr. Rogers putting on his shoes and his new jacket and the Power Rangers. You just can't see it. In our minds, Mr. Rogers does not equal Power Rangers. But in the mind of a child, Mr. Rogers does equal Power Rangers. How do I know this? Because I would watch Mr. Rogers and Spider-Man and, He-Man in the same day, and at no point in my life did I ever think there was something wrong with them, that they were different. These were just shows I watched as a kid, and I thought they had the same morals in my mind. But there's a problem, and as an adult, we see it, but as a child, we just didn't see it. For example, when I was in grade school, I was told, or one of the grade schools I went to anyway, I was told not to say gun. We weren't allowed to make guns, or, we weren't allowed to pick up a stick and pretend it was a gun. We weren't allowed to go boom, boom. We weren't allowed to say gun. It scared the adults. They were like, oh, you can't say gun. And by the way, this was like 1987, so don't think about Columbine or anything like that. It was just some weird parents. And that's really ironic because the movie Rambo had just come out, and guess what every single kid I knew was talking about? That's right, Rambo. We all wanted to see it so much. Oh, Rambo was so cool. We used to chase each other around going, Rambo! Rambo! But in our child's minds, it wasn't like what everybody else was viewing. What we saw was a very cartoonish figure. The closest thing I could give to you as an example would be Hot Shots Part 2, where the guy is just shooting around. And yes, I know that's... Oh, dang it, I forget his name. But yes, I know it's that guy. And, the entire scene where people are just pretending to die and it's just all comical. That is how a child imagined it. That's how every child I knew, every kid I knew when I was that age, thought of Rambo. In our minds, it was all a cartoon. The entire Rambo thing was just this cartoonish, playful thing, and that's what we were mimicking. We were not mimicking anything in real life. So why the conflict? Well, the adult mind is scared of violence. And that isn't a joke at all. In the adult mind, Rambo was about veterans from Vietnam. It was entirely about, veterans freaking out and their difficulties trying to, go through hell and come back and try to live a normal life. And that was a common thing being talked about in multiple movies. Ironically, there were people in other TV shows that were Vietnam veterans and weren't messed up as Rambo. But, like Mr. T, for example. The entire A-team was Vietnam vets. But in the adult mind, the Vietnam War was this big, epic thing, and Rambo was representative of it. And we don't like to admit it, but we sometimes have an emotion, and we don't like to admit that the emotion in our minds is evil. So, violence is a sin. Having killing is a sin, or, hurting others is a sin. So thoughts of violence must be sinful thoughts. I thought about hurting that person, so therefore I must be having sinful thoughts. I should end this. Therefore, cartoons or cartoonish ideas in a child's mind must equal evil, because cartoons show violence, and violence is against the rules, so therefore cartoons are evil. And we have the same thing in other things, like sex outside of marriage in the Bible is a sin, and it totally is. You can find that in multiple places. Therefore, thoughts of sex equals sinful thoughts, and you can find the sections in the Bible that talk about that. Christ himself mentioned it. And then it just says, therefore, being attracted to someone equals evil. And this creates a real conflict in the mind. The adult demands the child grow up. Stop thinking about this violence in this cartoonish way, because if you think about violence, that's a sinful thing and it is evil, so you shouldn't be thinking about violence, even though that's not how you're thinking about violence. Much in the same way, being attracted to somebody isn't evil, it's what you do with it. But the adult demands the child grow up. So we go into things like we see comics. Superman in the comics was very had a lot of cartoon violence. It was actually written by two 12-year-olds originally. That's not a joke either. And they would have Superman kind of stop bad things from happening, and it was very cartoonish at times. I think one of the more interesting things is the first comic he was released in, he beat up a guy who was beating his wife. That's not a joke. But, it was a very comical, kind of over-the-top, very colorful way of looking at it. But the parents said, grow up. Grow up. How dare you do this? Grow up. This needs, death and destruction and sorrow. Comics are not, just this thing where, cartoon violence happens. Show reality. Grow up. And so the comics writers created a very violent Batman. And by the way, Batman was violent right at the beginning. He killed people. He had no problems with, hurting others. And he even used guns. But there's various eras where they would change things around, but our modern comics show Batman or any comic character in a very violent and very, over-the-top way that isn't particularly cartoonish. It's kind of a different way. And the comic movies kind of exemplify this. Yes, there's death and destruction in the Marvel movies, in the Marvel Avengers movies, but it's all kind of colorful, and you don't feel that anybody is actually in danger. Whereas, the Justice League, I think that's all they talk about is, I'm so dark. And then the TV shows, they kind of, they're somewhere in between. They don't really, they do have dark things, but they're kind of lively and happy. But that's because we have grow up different versions. We have different versions of growing up, or in our minds. So in the puberty edition, when people say grow up, you think of angst, you think of hormones, and you think of yelling, which is what the comics became. They had a lot more angsty people, they had people being attracted to each other, and they had a lot more yelling in comics. And that shows up in a lot of TV shows and movies as well, is just kind of this puberty edition of growing up. And then we have, grow up as a young adult, 20 to 30 years old. And they're telling you to grow up, get married, have sex, go have kids, get a job. It's all going to be sad. And, there are tons of movies like this where people are trying to either achieve these or they've achieved them and they don't feel happy. And, they're just being told, well, grow up. And if you look at comics, when they first come out, or cartoons when they first come out, you're just like, ugh, it doesn't have any of this stuff. Therefore, it is not grown up. And, video games, if we were being honest, kind of follow this idea. Every single game you're looking at was made by the same company, many of the same people. They started off with this cartoonish version of a character who had an enormous smile and stuff. And 5 years later, they came out with a similar series called Jack and Daxter, and it was kind of cartoonish, but it had some darker elements. And by the time they had the third edition of that same TV series, it was very dark, and everybody was looking angry and kind of, they're ready for business. And then, the very next thing they worked on was about a guy, a much older guy, and there's a lot more violence, and there's a lot more people dying, and there's the cartoonishness is gone. It's disappeared. And then finally they make a show about a guy having to kill people because he wants to protect his daughter or his daughter figure. And they're all trying to talk about, what it's like to be a dad and how sad it is and how rage-filled you feel. And you'll look and you'll find out that these games were all made by the same people, and they were all thinking that they're following the lifespan of the video game player. They started out as kids and they slowly became an adult. So you can see them growing up in the minds of the creators. But then something happens. Then you hit your 30s and realize it's nicer than you ever thought. And that is one of the weirdest things in the world. I actually hit it the other last year, where I just went, wow, I've accomplished everything I wanted to. Everything that child me wanted to do, I've done. And, all the cool things I wanted to do in my teenage years, yeah, I can do now. And, I've achieved it. I'm at the level of happiness I need to be. And, I was expecting a lot more yelling and stuff. So reality is more like Animal Crossing. Yes, there you can get into debt and you can have tons of things you got to do. And yes, there's a lot of work to be done in Animal Crossing. You definitely have, one of the things you do work on is, paying off your house and your mortgage and all that. I was like, wow, that was accurate to being in your 30s. But you also meet tons of people and you make friends and you kind of get into a groove and you find out what life is like. And this is ironic because Animal Crossing is actually based on what it's like to move as a kid. I mean, as a kid who moved around a lot, I thought Animal Crossing was very accurate to that feeling. But now as an adult, I go, that's what it's like to move into a new company, or move into a new town, even as an adult. So let's follow this pattern. The little boy laughs at a cartoon, and then they see action movies as cartoons. They see Rambo, they see the Avengers, they're like, oh, it's a cartoon. And then they mimic these cartoons. I have literally heard a kid yell Power Rangers as he was chasing his friends. He was like, Power Rangers, Power Rangers. And then everybody's like, oh, grow up, grow up. You shouldn't act this way. That's violent. Don't you understand what this means? And then, they hit the angsty feelings and they're like, oh, we need to make our cartoons darker. We need to, make it look more adult. And then they worry that everybody's going to judge them. Then one day it's just not bad anymore. And, the angst is gone. The hormones are gone. You're doing pretty well. And then finally you recognize it. And you have this really weird moment where you look at Mr. Rogers and you look at action movies and you realize, oh, this is just cartoons. It's just, they're trying really hard to hide Bugs Bunny and Tweety, or Bugs Bunny and, his Yosemite Sam. And Mr. Rogers was right in that he said that you should go look for the helpers. You should go look for, the people that would help. And, if you ever watch the Power Rangers, they're constantly helping. So in our minds, we have this conflict because we don't want to admit that a kid mimicking something he saw on a TV show is not particularly evil. And if we do it correctly, the violence he'll feel will actually go away on its own, and he will be perfectly fine. But we don't want to admit this because this means that we have to think of, the different ways people think of things, and the different ways and the ways that a younger person would want to do things. And that's really difficult to admit because we want them all to grow up. And I got to tell you, the most ironic thing in the world is Mr. Rogers was one of the most grown-up people in the world, and he taught about all sorts of really sad things, and at no point did you feel unhappy when you see him, because he knew the truth. It just isn't bad anymore, and life is good. Okay, catch y'all later. I might make another video, I might not. I don't know. This week has just been really difficult for me, so catch y'all later.